So to close out this introduction module, I just want to add in a little bit of information around learning, science of skill acquisition in general, just because this is something that it doesn't necessarily fit exactly in with the rest of what we've been talking about. But when it comes to looking at how you apply all these things in the bigger picture, actually understanding how the brain likes to learn things, what makes the brain more adaptable to learning can be really useful. So this is kind of on the flip side of plasticity. There are certain events that need to take place for the brain to want to rewire itself in terms of actually solidifying knowledge long term. There's also a couple of things that we need to take into consideration. So when it comes to training, a lot of what we talked about is your brain is just constantly trying to adapt to survive. It's always trying to figure out how is the environment changing? How do I fit into this? The whole idea of play that we used to think existed only in mammals, and now it seems to be, the more people look, the more they find play in other animals, other creatures. But one of the things that it might be helpful to think about is the whole idea for play existing is because once an organism becomes a certain size, it realizes that the length of time it will be alive is long enough for the world to change in a significant way. And so the brain of this organism realizes that if it comes out fully pre-programmed and unable to make lots of decisions and lots of changes to the standard wiring, let's say, then later on down the line, when the seasons change or the world heats up, something like that happens, it needs to figure out how is it going to adapt. And so play is one of the best ways of the brain to be able to try out new things. And so for most younger mammals especially, they all engage in play, as well as other things. As humans, we can pretty much engage in play in any kind of way, including looking at training for autonomics and stuff like that. But it's quite interesting to see that this is a tool that we have, and learning really is a tool that we have to help deal with the fact that the world isn't always going to be the same. If it was, we would have no need to ever make any decisions, either consciously or unconsciously. So we're just going to look at a couple of the techniques that the brain has to make sure that we're able to learn tasks and fine-tune them when they're learned. So the first thing that's interesting to note is when the brain is learning a new skill, the bit that it's really interested in is not what is the same. So not what is happening currently. It's actually interested in what is the differences. What are the differences between every attempt? So if you think about the first time you ever learned to throw a ball, if the brain was paying attention to everything being the same and trying to just make sure everything's always the same and focusing on those things, then you would only ever really be able to throw a ball the exact same way that you did the first time, which was probably absolute garbage. When you see toddlers do anything for the first time, they don't do it with smooth, precise coordination. What the brain does instead is it figures out, all right, well, I know that we're probably not getting this right first time over, and there's probably room to improve. So instead of focusing on the similarities, it focuses on the differences, and it finds out, how was this attempt different to the last time? What are the variables? What are all the things that can be different every single time that I do this, as well as what's the variation in the movement? And it tries to figure out how many different ways is it actually possible for the body to move and still achieve the same outcome. The neural pathways, however, that always end up being the same. So if you are throwing the ball and the neural pathway for lifting up your shoulders, general movement, lifting up the shoulders always engages, then the brain is going to try to fine-tune that a little bit. It's going to coat that pathway with a substance called myelin. It's like this fatty tissue, and that creates this like pressure difference. That means the signal can travel twice as fast, 10 times as fast through between one neuron and another. So anytime we're doing something the same over and over again, the brain's going to cover those sections in myelin, but the rest of the brain is trying to figure out again, all right, cool, this is what is the non-negotiables, and we need to make sure we're always aware of what the differences are. And because the brain's laid out this way, there's two things that we need to focus on. One is how the brain is paying attention, how the brain is adapting in general, and then the other is when we do have a skill that we want to learn precisely, what considerations do we need to take in there? So first of all, when it comes to general learning and adaptability, once myelin is formed around the neuron, so once you've set that fatty layer around and got the signals firing quicker, it's really hard to get that set of neurons to fire in a different way. So this obviously, in terms of survival, isn't going to be so good for a brain that realizes the world might one day change. So anything that doesn't need to be habituated and made a really strong connection, it doesn't necessarily want to. One of the ways that we can do that is to expose ourselves to as wide a range of movements as possible, especially in the initial stages of learning. So as adults especially, you might see a couple of kids who act more like this, but as adults, we become really ingrained in the idea of, time is precious, it's a finite resource. We need to get working on the form and the function. Everything needs to be really precise right from the very beginning. From my experience teaching adults in all sorts of different disciplines, but most specifically gymnastics and acrobatics, more often than not, people want to be told exactly how to do things, and they want feedback on, am I doing this exactly right from the very beginning? And that is not what your brain likes to do. It likes to be doing things the other way. If I want you to do a forward roll, I just want to show you the general idea, and your brain just wants you to have the general idea. Obviously it wants to be safe and not get hurt, but the bare minimum of information is often better because that will get the body moving in lots of different ways. So you've got the same outcome, but your body's moving lots of different ways. Once I start to tell people, you need to bring your elbows into here, you need to make sure your fingers are spread, you need to make sure at this exact point you're going to tuck your head into your chest, all of those things that I restrict makes it harder for the brain to deal with those when they eventually crop up. So if I want to go and learn something else later on down the line, and actually it turns out that these specific actions aren't useful for me, it's going to be much harder for the brain to unpick that and unlearn it, let's say. So when it's the initial stages of learning, we want to expose ourselves to as wide a range of things as possible, as wide a range of movements. Don't be too strict on the form. Don't be too strict on the discipline, as long as things are kept safe. And by the way, usually the dose is the poison in these circumstances. So if you are getting people to lift crazy heavy weights, then form may actually matter, just because you're getting them to do something that is actually quite dangerous for somebody who's brand new to that thing. If you were getting them to do something much smaller, then very good chance they could do it whatever way they like. A barbell at some point becomes a broom handle. There's a certain weight that you would never think how you're lifting it up. You could pick it up right from the very end. You could pick it up with a thumb and a finger on its own, and then at a certain weight you start placing a little bit more attention, and then you start placing a little bit more attention again, and then when we start getting into actual very heavy weights in powerlifting, then there's a point where it actually matters, and people are then going to start looking at the correct form. But before that, actually, if it doesn't matter, we probably shouldn't be pushing it. Similarly, when it comes to adaptability and learning future skills, the wider the ranges of experience we've had in our lives, the easier it's going to be to adapt to new skills or situations. So what that is going to mean is, while there is limited research that skills are massively transferable, and we'll talk about when it comes to specificity. When it comes to specificity, there's limited evidence that, learning chess is going to make you better at word association or other types of, highly mental things. So Rubik's Cube, something that I do a lot of. I always get the comment, oh, you must be really good at chess too, because they both involve your brain and similar types of logic. And absolutely not. I'm terrible at chess. The things don't really translate. However, when it comes to the ability to learn things quickly and the ability to adapt things, so when you have to change your habits and change your technique in the sport that you love, if you have had more experience of learning lots of different things, there are processes in the brain that has got used to, oh, here's a new thing. I need to figure out how to learn that as quickly as possible. Here's another new thing. The more often that you're switching between different tasks as well, the better the brain becomes at switching between tasks. So the wider the range of things, even things that appear not to matter at all, if you can just expose yourself to as much as possible, you actually put your brain in a better position for learning the thing that you actually care about, even if you don't max out all of those stats right away. Now, on the other side of the coin, range is a really good strategy for actually learning. But once we already know the parameters of the task, then, like I said, transferability is limited. We want to hone in on specificity. So if it's sprinting that I want to be good at, then the closer I can get to sprinting in everything I'm doing in my training, the more likely the transferability is going to be there. And a lot of the time, your brain pays attention. Again, it's paying attention to what can be different, but the habits are formed by what is the same. So if you're going for your 100-meter sprint, if you're varying the distance all the time, then your brain isn't going to know how much fuel to proportion to the run. Or if you're doing lots of core workout exercises because you know that they're important, but you're doing them lying down on a ground or balanced on like a Bosu ball or something. And then when you go onto the running track, you're not on the ground, you're not lying down, you're not on a Bosu ball. Actually, if you could find a way to do those core exercises in a way that is closer matched to the posture that you're going to have while running, there's a better chance that the brain is going to be able to lay down those myelinated pathways, the layer of fat that speeds up the transmission. So the more specific we can get, the better. And it has to be stuff based around the parameters that we know. So if your race is always 100 meters, then maybe actually 100 meters is what you always want to be training. If your race is variable in time, you don't know how long it's going to last, then you maybe don't want to have a fixed time structure all the time. Time is actually a really big one. So anytime you can work out the maximum and the minimum time, it's almost always better to be working within those times. But just figuring out, what things will always stay the same and then what things will always be different. We work with a lot of circus performers as well. And one of the big things in circus is you get to train a lot with the equipment that you're going to be using on stage, but you don't necessarily get to train a lot with the types of lights and the temperature and all of those other variables. So anything that can be changed, you probably want to change those things all the time and get your brain used to as wide a range of those as possible, as well as adapting to new ones. So, if you're always going to be in a different room when you perform in your sport, then maybe you need to figure out, how can I always do this in a different room or a different environment, or with different temperature, with different lights, with different music blaring out, with different sight lines. Those are the things that you want to change because you need the brain to learn this is always going to be different. And then from that, it's going to work out everything that can be the same. And anything that is always going to be the same, you can always keep the same. Finally, then on the note of habits, so we're talking about if you have got into the habit of laying down myelin on those neural pathways, and so you've built a habit that is hard to change, but you now need to change it. There's a couple of things that we can be doing to implement that. So the obvious one is increase reps or intensity of the new pattern. So that's the one of the main neural plasticity rules was do it more often or do it in a more intense way, and eventually over time the habit gets broken. That is probably the slowest way to do it, because again, once you're laying down this myelin, the signal is going to work much, much faster. So you have to, let's say it's posture, and I've sat with slouch posture for 30 years. If my brain has cannot say that word today, myelinated those pathways, then chances are, if you do the same intensity, it's going to take more than 30 years to undo it. If you increase the intensity only by a little bit, it might still take the 30 years just because you're starting from ground zero, whereas the other one has had foundations built around it to keep it doing that thing because it has learned that that's the way that it wants things to be. The two more useful things that we can do, number one, is change the starting point. So if you're going to throw a ball and you've got chronic shoulder pain, and what we know from chronic pain is the brain has got used to firing that pain signal because it's just so used to being in pain by this point that it's just firing that signal over and over again. One of the triggers for getting that pathway going is the position that you start in. So if you always start by taking a step forwards with your left foot, you might find you can break the habit easier by changing that. You might take a step backwards with your left foot, take a step forwards with your right foot, do something with your head, find something that gets you into that position in a different way. Same if you were going to perform a backflip and you swing your arms down. Maybe swinging your arms in a circle is the better way to do it because the brain doesn't get as easy an indication that you're about to do the thing that is the habit. It thinks that you're doing something different, and probably eventually it realizes, this is the thing, and it starts firing that myelinated pathway. But the more you can change things, the easier it normally is. So the actual movement is what we talked about. The position, so if you just change where you are in space. So, if it's a habit that happens in your training space, actually, maybe you can do it outside the training space for a little while. And then finally, the speed. So doing stuff really, really slowly, or if you're training stuff that's quite slow already, doing it as fast as possible can also help to break the cycle. And then if you bring the speed up or down to slowly to match what you would like it to be, very often you can see the improvement there. And then finally, move in a way that improves your autonomic function. So if your throw is done in a way that causes your rib cage to slouch and you don't breathe so well, if you can start practicing the throw in a way that opens the rib cage up and you can breathe better, then your brain is going to prefer that much, much more, and it's more likely that it's going to solidify that. So any kind of movement, if you notice any of the autonomic functions that are not working so well, so, if you can't see very much because your head is down, or if your balance is compromised because of the position that you're in, if you move yourself to a position that has your head more open and you can see more things, your brain's going to enjoy that much more than the previous position. And again, it's going to be easier to change that habit. So hope that was useful. There are more kind of bonus bits than the core stuff of this module, but that concludes the first module.